There is a weed growing through the pavement outside your door. You have probably stepped over it 100 times. Small white flowers, feathery leaves, easy to miss, easy to ignore.
I think I know the one. I always assumed it was just a weed.
That is exactly what most people assume. But that plant has a name older than most cities. And its story begins on a battlefield in ancient Greece, soaked in blood, where one of history's greatest warriors knelt down and reached for exactly what you just walked past.
Wait, a warrior for a weed?
Not a weed, yarrow. And once you know what it has done, you will never look at it the same way again. Your ancestors did not have antiseptic. They did not have bandages or sterile dressings or anything that came in a plastic wrapper. What they had was the land around them and thousands of years of desperate, careful attention to what worked and what did not. Yarrow worked. It worked so reliably, so consistently across so many different cultures and continents that it stopped being just a plant. It became a legend.
So how far back are we talking?
Far back, to a time when the boundary between medicine and myth was not a line anyone had thought to draw. Picture ancient Greece. Not the marble columns and philosophers you might imagine, but something older and wilder. A world where the gods were not distant. They walked among you, advised you, trained you. In that world, a child's education was not just about letters and numbers. It was about survival, about understanding the land, the seasons, the plants that could save a life, and the plants that could end one. And for the boy who would become the greatest warrior of his age, that education began in a forest on the slopes of Mount Pelion.
And who was teaching him?
His teacher was Chiron, and Chiron was nothing else alive.
Chiron, the centaur?
Half man, half horse. But where other centaurs were wild and violent, Chiron was wise, measured, ancient. He was said to have been placed among the stars by the gods themselves, eventually becoming the constellation Centaurus. But before that, he taught. He was the tutor of heroes, Achilles, Jason, Asclepius, who would go on to become the god of medicine himself. What Chiron passed on was not just fighting technique, it was a complete philosophy of the body and the natural world. Combat and healing were not opposites in Chiron's teaching, they were two sides of the same knowledge. To understand how to wound was to understand how to mend.
That is actually a remarkable idea, that a warrior would need to be a healer too?
It was not just an idea, it was practical necessity. On a battlefield, far from any city, with nothing else available and everything at stake, the soldier who knew how to treat a wound was the soldier who survived. And among the plants Chiron taught Achilles to use, yarrow held a special place. The ancient sources are consistent on this point. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, who documented the natural world in extraordinary detail in the 1st century, recorded that Achilles used this herb to treat the wounds of his soldiers during the siege of Troy. The Greek physician Dioscordes, whose 5-volume work on medicinal plants became the foundation of European herbal medicine for over 1,000 years, also documented yarrow's wound-healing properties and connected them directly to the Achilles legend.
So two of the most respected writers of the ancient world are both pointing at the same plant and the same warrior? That's not a coincidence.
It is not. And the connection became so established, so woven into the culture, that the plant eventually took his name, Achillea millefolium, the herb of Achilles. A plant named for a warrior because a warrior trusted it with the lives of his men.
But was Achilles actually real? Did the siege of Troy really happen?
That question matters less than you think, because the legend tells you something more important than a biography. It tells you that the people of ancient Greece looked at yarrow, watched what it did, and believed it was powerful enough to be the chosen tool of their greatest hero. That's not superstition. That's a culture encoding hard-won knowledge into story so it would survive long after the people who discovered it were gone.
So the myth was doing the job that a textbook does today.
Exactly. And the knowledge inside the myth was real. Which brings us to the question you're probably already asking.
Why does it actually work? What's in it?
Modern researchers have confirmed what those ancient healers observed with their own eyes. Yarrow contains compounds called tannins, natural astringents that cause blood vessels to constrict, slowing bleeding almost on contact with a wound. It contains azulene, a compound with strong anti-inflammatory properties, which gives yarrow essential oil its distinctive deep blue color. It contains flavonoids that support the body's own repair processes, and alkaloids, including achilletin, which research has specifically linked to the plant's ability to reduce bleeding time.
So when Achilles pressed yarrow leaves on a wound on the plains of Troy, it was actually doing something.
Every time. The ancient Greeks did not have the vocabulary to explain why, but they had the results. They pressed the leaves against wounds and watched the bleeding slow. The legend was just the wrapper around a biochemical truth that actually worked.
And then what happened to it? Did it stay in Greece?
The opposite. When the Roman legions marched across Europe, and they marched across almost all of it, they carried yarrow with them. This was not accidental. The Roman military was the most sophisticated logistical operation the ancient world had ever produced. Roman military physicians, known as medici, were trained professionals embedded in every legion. They documented what worked and standardized it across the entire army. And what worked for wounds, they called herba militaris, the military herb.
Herba militaris, the military herb, they actually gave it an official name.
They did. And consider what that means. At its height, the Roman army had somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 soldiers deployed across an empire stretching from Scotland to Syria. Every one of those soldiers operated within a medical system that included yarrow as a standard treatment. Across Britain, across Gaul, across the Rhine, and deep into territories that had never heard the name Achilles, yarrow arrived in the pouches of Roman field medics.
And it stayed.
Because it proved itself every time. The plant did not need the myth to earn its place. It proved itself every time a soldier was injured, far from any city, with nothing else available and everything at stake. By the time the Roman legions withdrew and the medieval period began, yarrow was already naturalized across most of Europe. It had hitched a ride on the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever produced.
And then the medieval healers picked it up.
In monastery gardens across Europe, monks cultivated yarrow alongside other healing plants, treating the sick who came to them with the same careful empiricism that Dioscorides had brought to his writing 1,000 years earlier. The 12th century abbess and healer Hildegard of Bingen, whose medical writings were among the most sophisticated of her era, documented yarrow among the plants she used for wound treatment and fever management.
So at this point, the plant has gone from a Greek legend to a Roman military standard to a medieval monastery garden. It just keeps finding a home.
Because it keeps earning one. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Because by this point, healers had been working with yarrow long enough to discover that its abilities went far beyond the battlefield.
What do you mean? What else could it do?
The wound healing properties were the foundation, the reason it earned its name and its legend. But healers also noticed that yarrow did something remarkable when taken as a tea during a fever. The body's response to fever involves sweating, a mechanism for releasing heat and fighting infection. Yarrow was observed to actively support this process. Nicholas Culpeper, the 17th century English herbalist whose work reached more ordinary people than almost any medical text before it, described yarrow's use in fevers and described it as a plant that worked with the body rather than against it.
So instead of suppressing the fever, it helped the body do what it was already trying to do.
Exactly. And that principle, working with the body's own processes rather than overriding them, appears again and again in how yarrow was used. The plant contains bitter compounds that stimulate the production of digestive juices, supporting the breakdown of food and easing the kind of sluggish digestion, bloating, and cramping that has troubled people in every era. Hildegard of Bingen noted its use for stomach complaints. Medieval physicians prescribed it after rich meals for the same reasons that bitter digestive liqueurs have remained part of European food culture to this day.
I never connected those things, the bitter after-dinner drink and the medieval herb garden.
The mechanism is the same. The bitters trigger a reflex that wakes up the digestive system. And then there is the area where yarrow held a particular significance that runs through the historical record with striking consistency: women's health.
In what way?
Across cultures and centuries, yarrow was associated with menstrual health, used to ease cramping, regulate irregular cycles, and reduce excessive bleeding. This was not coincidence. The same compounds that slowed external bleeding were observed to have a toning effect on smooth muscle tissue. Rudolf Weiss, whose textbook on herbal medicine became a standard reference in European medical schools, documented this action and the long tradition behind it.
So the same plant that stopped a soldier bleeding on a battlefield was also being used by women for something completely different across thousands of years, across the world?
The same plant, the same compounds, different applications of the same underlying biology. And there is one more use that kept appearing across the centuries: the skin. Rashes, eczema, inflamed or irritated skin, healers found that yarrow prepared as a wash or infused into an oil calmed inflammation and supported the skin's recovery. The azulene responsible for this is the same compound that makes chamomile effective for similar conditions, and yarrow was often used alongside chamomile for exactly this reason.
So wounds, fever, digestion, women's health, skin, this is not a simple herb. This is a whole medicine cabinet growing through the pavement.
That is exactly what it is. And what emerges from all of this is not the picture of a plant that got lucky with one good property and built a legend on it. Yarrow works across multiple systems of the body, through multiple mechanisms, in ways that have been observed, recorded, and confirmed across thousands of years and dozens of cultures. The Romans were not wrong, Hildegard was not guessing, Culpeper was not inventing. They were all describing the same thing, each in the language of their own time, and the modern laboratory has now given us the words to explain what they saw.
So why do most people have no idea about any of this?
Because progress has a way of making old knowledge invisible. When antibiotics arrived, when sterile dressings became cheap and available, the quiet competence of yarrow became easy to overlook. It did not stop working, it simply stopped being necessary in the same urgent, obvious way. But the plant did not disappear, it kept growing, through roadsides and meadows and garden walls and the gaps between paving stones. Patient, unassuming, exactly as it always was.
There is something almost stubborn about that, like it is just waiting for people to remember.
Researchers like Gary Paul Nabhan, who has spent decades documenting the relationship between people and plants, argue that this kind of accumulated knowledge, what anthropologists call ethnobotanical knowledge, is one of humanity's most undervalued inheritances. When a culture forgets which plants it once relied on, it loses something that took thousands of years to learn. Not superstition, evidence. Hard-won, carefully observed, passed down through legend and practice and the quiet persistence of the plants themselves.
And yarrow is still out there, right now.
Growing through the crack in your pavement. The same plant, the same compounds, the same quiet competence that earned it the name of a hero and carried it across a continent in the pouches of Roman soldiers. The next time you pass it, take a second to look at it properly. Small white flowers in flat clusters, leaves so finely divided they look almost like a fern. Millefolium, the ancient name, means 1,000 leaves. A faint, sharp scent if you crush one between your fingers.
The herb of Achilles.
Still there, still growing through the crack in your pavement, waiting for you to remember what it is.